With that, I turned over and I found a hot water bottle was cold, so I put it out on the floor, and when I did, I touched water. And I said to my husband, "There's water on the floor." He said, "I'll go to sleep, you burst the hot water bottle."
We looked out of the window. It was a moonlight night, and everywhere around us was water. And we could see the rabbit hutches all floating past and different things. And there we stayed all night. Of course, it was bitterly cold. The next morning, we could hardly believe when we looked out that there was water just everywhere. And looking across the field, we could see some cows huddled up onto a little bit of a mound.
Mabel Glennie and Margaret Moyes can still vividly recall the night they became victims of the worst flood disaster on the Thames this century. They lived on Canvey Island in Essex when the seawalls broke at the end of January 1953. Canvey Island lies below normal high tide levels. In its early history, it was flooded many times. But the disaster took the islanders living behind their defensive walls completely by surprise. There was no flood warning system, and the islanders found it hard to believe the seawalls had been breached. The district surveyor on Canvey was Reg Stevens.
He was knocked out by the local police sergeant at about 20 past midnight, and he told me he'd been getting reports of water coming over the seawalls on the northern part of the island. I immediately got dressed and went to the southern part of the island, which was near where we lived. And there was a very strong northwesterly gale. And the water near the seawall was relatively calm, and the moon was reflected in that water. But to my horror, I saw that the level of water was about a foot below the seawall. I knew that the seawall on the northern part of the island was a foot lower than the southern seawall, and realised that with the wave action, that there would be a major problem in the northern part of the island. I realised then that it was a major flooding disaster affecting Canvey Island. I went back to the office and had the fire brigade sound their warning sirens on the old air raid wailing note to try and wake people up, and got them firing maroons, trying to make a noise.
The warning sirens were heard by some islanders. Bernard Griffiths.
We heard the fire brigade siren go and thought, wow, that is some fire. And anyway, eventually went home in my little Morris 8 and was halfway up Seaview Road, which is the road opposite. And halfway up there, there is a dip in the road. And I ran into some fairly deep water, which cut my engine out. We got out to see what happened, and there was a fellow walking down the road. I turned around and asked him, I said, "That's some fire." And he turned around and said, "Oh, no, it's not a fire, mate. The island's flooded."
In the moonlight, I saw that there was water already about 6-7 feet deep, with people clinging onto the roofs of houses, some bodies of people already drowned, and one body I remember seeing spread-eagled in a tree. And it really was a quite horrific sight.
The first one we took off was an elderly gentleman who was on the flat roof of a garage, and we took him back to the Venge. And then sort of various people who were upstairs said they'd be all right. They were best left upstairs in their flats. But the worst one that I actually came across was when I came across a flat roof bungalow where there was a gentleman with his wife and 2 children, one a young baby, on the roof, and it was obvious that his wife was already dead. I could tell that, you know, from my thing. And I'm not quite certain whether it was the baby. I think it was the son as well. But he insisted on us taking them back to the boat before we took him. We heard a woman shouting for help. We went across to her bungalow and found that she was actually standing on the table, hanging on to the picture rail by her hands. Her hands were actually, had blood on them where she'd been hanging onto the picture rail.
Canvey Island and a large part of East Anglia had been hit by a freak tidal wave whipped up by strong northwesterly winds. Thames tides run north to south down the east coast and then funnel into the estuary. A following wind builds up a wall of water, the height and strength of which is unpredictable. These tidal waves or surges happen very rarely and have little to do with the normal day-to-day ebb and flow of the tides. But when they occur, they're devastating. and they threaten not only the estuary, but all those who live and work along the tidal Thames.
A huge lake of muddy salt water. This was the site of the Purfleet margarine factory of Vandenbergs and Jurgens that first Sunday in February 1953. Irresistibly, within an hour of midnight, a tide of unprecedented height had swept up the estuary with a 100-mile-an-hour gale howling behind it. Breaking through the wall and surging inland in a vast semicircle, it had engulfed the factory from behind. And in 2 hours, the site was under 20 million tons of water, rising and falling with the tide outside. Propelled by a few wooden margarine shovels, the first emergency shuttle service was organized in the factory area itself. Everyone took a hand, and some very mixed boat crews resulted.
As well as the margarine works at Purfleet, 200 other factories were wrecked in the 1953 floods. 24,000 homes were flooded, and the death toll was 300. More than 50 people died on Canvey Island. The same tidal surge which devastated Canvey rolled upriver towards London. Had it breached the embankments that night, the scale of devastation would have been massively greater. Canvey and other places along the east coast and the Thames estuary helped to save London. The flooding there took some of the force out of the surge. Canvey now huddles behind new and much higher defensive sea walls. A surge higher than 1953 wouldn't breach or overtop them. The tidal wave would be pushed upriver towards London. The threat of floods hasn't gone away. In fact, it's been getting greater. For 10,000 years since the end of the last ice age, sea levels have been rising and the southeast of England has slowly been sinking into the sea. Normal high tide levels have been rising. All the way up the Thames, flood defences and embankments have been raised gradually over the centuries. But the threat of a freak tide from the North Sea always remains. Since 1982, London and all those living on the tideway above Woolwich have been protected from a tidal surge by what has been described as the eighth wonder of the world, the Thames Barrier. Most of the time, the barrier remains open to allow shipping through. It guards against the threat of a very rare event. Tidal Control Manager Mike Taylor.
We're looking out for weather conditions in the North Sea, which would bring very strong northerly winds, which in turn would blow water southwards towards the Thames estuary and create what we call tidal surges in the southern part of the North Sea and the Thames estuary. This happened very severely in 1953. London was not seriously flooded at that time for two reasons. One, the weather abated before the peak of the surge came up the Thames, and secondly, a lot of water which might have flowed up the Thames flowed through breaches in the banks in Kent and Essex and thereby reduced the levels that otherwise would have occurred in London.
Whether or not to close the barrier is ultimately a matter of guesswork. Barrier manager John Hounslow.
We've closed the barrier against surge tides 8 times since 1982. What we're looking for is abnormal tidal movements in the North Sea, and we have to close on a forecast. The reality of that, I'm afraid, is that a lot of the closures turn out not to have been necessary, but you don't know until afterwards.
Gradually, science is taming the waters to work for man. The threat of danger to life and property daily diminishes. At Didcot, a working model...
The need for some kind of flood barrier had been recognised long before the present one was built.
London is in danger every time a high tide coincides...
For hundreds of years, London's riverside has been raised. These photographs were taken before the Victorian embankments were built. The embankments themselves have been continuously heightened, and they've sometimes been overtopped or breached. In central London, the worst flood disaster this century was in 1928, when the embankment wall burst at Millbank, drowning 15 people.
Research work is investigating the practicability of a permanent dam fitted with locks and sluices to control the river. It is known that high tide at London Bridge is rising by about 2 feet every century.
A permanent barrier holding back the sea was favoured at one time, but it was rejected. John Hounslow.
The traditional solution of raising banks was ruled out fairly early on. The walls would have come to such a height as to cut London off from the river. There were then something like 40 alternatives were looked at. mainly choosing between a barrage which would have rendered the river non-tidal and the kind of barrier we've got today, which preserves the tidal character of the river and keeps it open for the shipping.
The barrier that now protects London looks far too small to save a great metropolis from a tidal flood. But the fact that it can hold back the tides has been demonstrated on a number of occasions.
Perhaps the most unusual use we've made of the barrier was after the Marchioness disaster, when the emergency services rang and asked if we could close the barrier to stop the tidal movement and prevent the divers being swept off the wreck. We did that, and within 20 minutes of the barrier being closed, they had virtually still water conditions at the accident site.
Downriver from the barrier, defences have had to be raised and are constantly checked by the barrier team. How long these defences and the barrier will last has been a matter of fierce debate in recent years. The rise in sea levels due to global warming has raised fears. But there's official confidence that the barrier will defend London for another 50 years.
The barrier was designed to last until 2030 with a very high level of protection. Human beings being what they are, everybody added a bit for luck. And fortunately, we have a barrier which is likely to be able to cope even with moderate projections as to what will happen with global warming.
London may be protected from a tidal flood for half a century or more, but upriver the Thames continues to overflow its banks every winter. Earlier this year, the Maidenhead region was inundated by the rising river. These freshwater floods have nothing in common with tidal floods, except that they're caused by exceptionally bad weather conditions. The Thames region of the National Rivers Authority, which has responsibility for doing something about the problem of floods, has discovered that many people can't understand that the Thames barrier doesn't protect them. The authority's technical planning manager, John Gardner.
One of the most surprising things to come out of the recent survey we did was that it seems that a quarter of the people who are living in the Thames floodplain in the Maidenhead area actually believe they're protected from flooding by the Thames barrier. I wish this were true, but unfortunately the Thames barrier only really gives protection as far up as Teddington. And they're, of course, a long way upstream from that.
Throughout this century, the Upper Thames has overflowed its banks. Some years, like 1928 and 1929, are worse than others. But all those who live by the river on the floodplain should expect to be flooded from time to time. The trouble is that the floods hit some places more severely than others each time, and people forget about the threat of the river.
From flooded Maidenhead, our reporter sends us this dispatch. The army comes to the rescue of the marooned Thameside town. In the past 3 months, the British soldier has delivered the meat, carried the coal, and driven the lorries.
Within living memory, the worst floods were in the winter of 1947-48. Freak weather conditions brought steadily rising water over several weeks. Rain and melting snow ran off frozen ground. The earth, which normally acts as a sponge, was sealed. Unlike tidal floods, which happen suddenly, these upriver inundations take time. George Kenyon lived on an island in the Thames near Weybridge in 1947.
Initially, we used to moor the dinghy at the foot of the garden because I used to go backwards and forwards each day in the dinghy to get to work. And then gradually I had to bring it right up the garden and tie it up to the veranda. And the water started to creep up the veranda steps. And each time I thought, well, it can't come any further because it was then far beyond the biggest flood we'd had for a long time. And then one night there was a very severe storm in the West Country when The water came up about 8 inches overnight, and this began then to come through the floorboards of the bungalows. This is when we had to get out.
Whether the river is in flood or not, its flow is regulated throughout the year by the Thames lock keepers. Though their job has always been to allow boats to move up and down the river, they have an equally important task regulating the flow of water. When the river's low, they shut off the weirs to maintain a depth of water. When it's high, they open the weirs to let the water through. This is the old Paddle and Rhymer weir at Radcott above Oxford. If the lock keeper got his timing wrong, he could cause a flood, as Eric Eade discovered in the 1950s.
One day it rained, incessant rain all day long, and I was worried, and I kept looking every so often at the water level to see if it's rising. I was just really anticipating it coming up. Went right on through the evening, right until 11 o'clock at night. I was still looking at it, and it was still normal level. Well, you can't open up in anticipation because you're going to drain the river down. So I went to bed. And I woke up the next morning, sort of about 8 o'clock, and looked out the window and nearly had kittens. This is my first lock, by the way, my first charge. And the water had risen so much in the night, it was actually coming over the top of the lock gates. It was flowing past the office door over there. I had to put gumboots on to actually get to the office. And all around the fields either side, it looked more like the mouth of the Mississippi than a minor part of the Thames. It's not like a mistake in bookkeeping that nobody needs to see it until the auditor comes. You know, you can't hide a 2 miles wide river. The trouble was there was so much water built up at this end that we had to open more weir than we normally do in order to let it go. So we sent a great tidal wave down to the next lock without being able to warn him, because I wasn't on the telephone. I subsequently found out that St John's Lock at the top end of the river had opened half his weir at midnight. I stood no chance.
One of the beliefs of those who live along the river is that the manipulation of locks and weirs is used to protect other people at their expense. John Gardner.
Our survey showed that people actually believe that we somehow stop the water and hold it back upstream to prevent flooding in London. Now, that just isn't true. There is no way that we can actually prevent the natural occurrence of flooding by closing weirs and so on. And in fact, long before the river starts overflowing its banks, all the weirs on the Thames in the vicinity are open.
This was in July, June or July, and the whole of everybody's weir from Letchlade right the way through was wide open, letting everything go as fast as we could. And when you've opened your weir, you can do no more. It just flows, that's it. And I had this irate bloke one day. I answered my phone in the lock office, and I get greeted with, "When are you going to let this bloody water go?" Oh, it's charming, isn't it? First thing in the morning, you see. The stupid part about it was he lived below me anyway. He said, "This water's halfway up my lawn." He says, "I'm not prepared to tolerate it any longer," he said. And he said, "And what's the reason for it?" He said, "I think I know what it is. You're holding it back for Henley," which is ridiculous anyway, because, I mean, he was below me, and if I was holding it back, he wouldn't be flooded. So, you know, I mean, he got it totally wrong anyway. And I said, "Do you realise," I said, "that they've had 4 1/4 inches of rain and half a frame that's flooded?" "I'm not interested in your bloody technicalities," he said. I said, "Well, I'll give you a number to ring," and I gave him head office number. I thought, well, he can bend their ear.
Every winter, Port Meadow on the outskirts of Oxford floods. The great flocks of wading birds that come to feed on the rich pastures are testimony to the fact that the overspilling of the Thames on its floodplain is a natural event. If the river didn't flood, they'd have to look elsewhere for their winter feed. Attempts to control flooding conflict with the present concerns for the ecology of the river. Since the last war, many houses have been built on land that was bound to flood every 10 or 20 years. The new developments themselves make things worse because water runs more quickly into the river off the new roads and through household drains. In the long run, if you live by a river, you have to accept the dangers as well as the pleasures. The story of Canvey Island is a classic tale of people searching for a home by the Thames, unaware of the threat the river poses. It was a rustic resort at the beginning of the century. Earlier in history, the Dutch had drained it and walled it in for sheep farming. It was cheap land near the river and the coast. For years, the tides rose and fell without causing any trouble. Today, nearly 40 years on from the terrible flood of 1953, many of the survivors continue to live happily behind their new sea wall. Living by the Thames has its dangers, but over the centuries, the river has been, for all those who live along it, a life force. After the disaster, Mabel Glennie and her family returned to Canvey.
We came to Canvey because we found a very nice house with a large garden and fruit trees, and also my husband could have a little boat here, which he had always wanted. And as to flooding, it never entered our heads until the insurance films came through. One of the questions was, is there any danger of flooding? To which my husband replied, not unless the sea walls broke. Well, when we bought our house, it was very old-fashioned, and we spent over £500 putting new fireplaces in and making it a little more modern. And this was all finished on October, the end of October, and the night of January the 31st, when the flood waters came in, the whole lot was ruined. We finally managed to get back to the house about 2 weeks afterwards by wearing seaman's boots and wading across. And there the destruction was just unbelievable. And the smell was terrible. You could just not imagine. There were even dead fish lying around. And everything was saturated. I was quite all right, and I saw the children's photographs had been spoiled, and then, of all things, I burst out crying. There was everything else ruined around me, but that just set me going. However, I decided that was a bit daft, and we'd have to set to and do what we could. When we first came back to the bungalow, every time the wind blew very strongly, I was very, very frightened. So were the children. But eventually, when the new sea wall was built, there's such a wonderful wall that one felt completely safe, and we never thought of leaving the island again after that, because we loved it here, and we've had a very happy life here and lived here for 38 years.